Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa of India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. Every week, we will bring you key issues of concern and get you perspectives and clarity as to why these issues matter to you and bring out one clear truth from this. In this episode, we will be dealing with Sri Lanka, the teardrop-shaped island that is at the southern tip of India and that has been in the news for all the wrong reasons. Just as it happened in Pakistan a couple of months ago, the island is in turmoil. The current ruling dispensation is in deep trouble and the country faces an economic meltdown. Inflation is soaring. Food and fuel prices have gone up by as much as 47%. And there is a popular unrest that has almost consumed the country. Its popular Prime Minister, Mahinda Rajapaksa, had to resign on May 9th and make way for a new Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe, who is a very experienced campaigner. He has been 4 times Prime Minister earlier, but faces a very difficult task. In this episode, we will examine what was the genesis of the downfall of one of the most popular families in Sri Lanka, the Rajapaksas, who had ruled in the last couple of years and had ruled earlier. What is going to happen next in Sri Lanka? Why are these episodes of concern to India, and what are the big lessons we can learn from what happened in Lanka? If there is one family that is responsible for the political and economic crisis, it is the Rajapaksas. At one time, they were the heroes of Sri Lanka. When they defeated the Tamil Tiger leader, V. Prabhakaran, and killed him between 2000 and 2010. Subsequently, they fell into disfavor and in fact lost the elections in 2015, but came roaring back in 2019. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the current president, was elected with a landslide majority. Then he made his first big mistake. In his speech, he talked about how he favored the nationalist Sinhala Buddhists that constitute around 70% of the population, and neglected to mention the Hindus and the Muslims that form the remaining percentage, and they felt alienated. That time there was the Sinhala triumphalism. This would have an impact once the country went on crisis, and his ability to deal and get the nation together would be impacted. While Gotabaya came with such a majority, he had actually promised that he would remove taxes, and in fact cut them considerably, and also in terms of the goods and services tax, what they call value-added tax, he had also cut that drastically. This was a poll promise. And while the rich, as well as the businessmen and even the middle class welcomed it initially, that decision to cut taxes, in fact, what happened in Sri Lanka is while Sri Lankan taxpayers were about 1.5 million, in 2019, they were reduced to 500,000. While that and in the beginning seemed like a really good populist measure, as the crisis deepened in Sri Lanka, particularly the economic crisis, that was seen as Gotabaya's second big mistake, because revenues fell when the economy went down, and that is one of the causes of the collapse of what we are seeing of the economy right now. Soon after that, in 2020, as we all know, COVID struck, and the way Gotabaya handled both the health and the economic aspects of it won him popularity. So much so that in August 2020, when the parliamentary elections were held, his party, the SLPP, won with a landslide majority, and that saw his brother, Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was also a very experienced politician, come to power again and become the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. But the Rajapaksas were not content in controlling 2 of the key posts. Mahinda was Prime Minister and Gotabaya was the President. They brought more of their family into the cabinet. Basil, the younger brother, became the Finance Minister, a key post. Chamal, their eldest brother, became the Agriculture Minister. And in what seemed like a clear succession, an heir apparent, Namal, the son of Mahinda Rajapaksa, became the Youth and Sports Minister. Then Gotabaya went one step ahead. He got the parliament to endorse with a 2/3 majority the 20th Amendment, which gave the president executive powers. He became all-powerful again. Then the Rajapaksas began to slip badly. COVID's deleterious impact began to affect the economy considerably. Exports dropped, both textiles and tea, and tourism, one of the mainstays of the island, was hit badly. Also hit were foreign exchange remittances from Sri Lankan workers abroad. They had also contributed a substantial amount to the foreign reserves that the country had. And as the foreign reserves dipped, Gotabaya came out with a brainwave. He was advised that there was a lot of chemical fertilizers being hoarded in the country, and much of this was being imported from other countries, and if he stopped that, he could save the reserves as well as switch to organic farming, which he considered to be the future of agriculture. But he was ill-advised because they really did not have that much chemical fertilizers, and when he imposed a ban, paddy production, which was the mainstay of agriculture, dropped by as much as 40%. And worse, the farmers were very angry, and the farmers had supported the SLPP and Rajapaksas immensely, and they lost this particular constituency by this one single act. Around the same time, the Rajapaksas made their fourth big mistake. They were always seen inclined towards China as compared to India, and they made their intentions clear that when they cancelled what was called the East Terminal Project. This was at the Colombo port. It was a container terminal, and they cancelled it overnight. This was signed with India and Japan in 2019 by the previous government, and they used the excuse of union protests to terminate the agreement. Months later, they would give it to the Chinese to develop. This caused anger among India and deep concern, because already China was close friends with Pakistan, and this nexus between North and South was worrying. But as events proved subsequently, the Rajapaksas' reliance in China would actually cause them huge problems, because when the crisis came, they found that China was neither a friend in need nor in deed. By early this year, the writing was clearly on the wall. The economy was in doldrums, inflation had soared, foreign exchange reserves had dropped, to the point that the country was not able to even import or pay for the imports that they needed, including food and fuel. Then they made their fifth big mistake, which is that the brothers, Rajapaksa brothers in the cabinet, stopped communicating with each other. Mahinda was the most experienced, Basil too had experience, Gotabaya was the earlier defense minister, but as president, he seemed not to be heeding the advice of Mahinda, who had the most political experience. And they openly sort of showed their differences. This began to have an impact across the country, and as protests grew, Gotabaya decided that he had to in some ways to placate the protesters, reduce the salience of the Rajapaksa family. So he got Basil to resign as finance minister, Chamal had to pull out as agriculture minister, and Namal, the youth and sports minister, had to also resign. This he did in a kind of a cabinet reshuffle way, where other cabinet ministers also resigned. Despite the fact that 3 Rajapaksas were asked to resign, as well as many members of the cabinet, the protest didn't stop. The SLPP, the ruling party, began to show its concern, with many members targeting now Mahinda Rajapaksa himself to quit. Finally, Gotabaya took that decision on May 9th. Mahinda Rajapaksa had to resign as prime minister, but when he did so, he had called all his supporters. They then turned on to the protesters, and there was a lot of violence. That sparked even greater riots across the country, with almost 36 MPs' houses being burnt. One of the MPs was killed. This made Gotabaya declare an emergency and had shoot-at-sight orders imposed. And Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was once the hero of Sri Lanka, had to flee in a helicopter to a naval base for safety. Meanwhile, the protesters now started targeting Gotabaya directly. Both the opposition as well as leaders of these various protests started saying, "Gota, go home." And this slogan became viral. In a desperate bid to stem the anarchy, Gotabaya asked his arch rival and veteran politician Ranil Wickremesinghe to become the Prime Minister. Ranil Wickremesinghe, though, despite the fact that he is a four-time Prime Minister, faces an immense task. In the coming months, he has to pull the economy out of the morass and the troubles that it is in. And ironically, Ranil Wickremesinghe is the sole representative of his party, the UNP, in the 225-member parliament. So his political legitimacy, there's a lot of criticism that he really doesn't have the political mandate to rule the country. But because Gotabaya had invited him and asked him to come, he is sure to get the ruling party, the SLPP, support, as well as now he's negotiating with the opposition leaders, and he could get a breakaway faction because he's offering cabinet posts that is there. But it is going to be a difficult task. He not only, once he negotiates with the IMF, and they said that the amount that they might ask for a bailout is about $4 billion, the IMF will demand structural reforms, and this could hurt the common man. And in the next few months, Wickremesinghe's ability as both a politician and as an ability to govern the country would be severely tested. For India, the developments in Sri Lanka are a major concern. India has always insisted that there should be a democratically elected political formation in Sri Lanka and has made it stand clear. And despite the hostile attitude that the Rajapaksas had when in the time of need, India was the first and biggest responder. It immediately extended a $1.5 billion line of credit to Sri Lanka for fuel and food, and also extended another $1 billion or $2 billion in terms of various other forms of assistance for the current crisis. This has made it win the support of the people, the common persons in Sri Lanka, and they now recognize and acknowledge that it is possibly better to have India as a friend who's a neighbor rather than China. And that is a very important development for India. With Sri Lanka feeling that it can trust India more, in the recent past, there have been major investment projects that India has made into Sri Lanka, whether it's in ports, renewable energy, and in hydrocarbons. There has been various agreements, and this has strengthened the bond between the two countries. Most importantly for India, India has been insisting and saying that this is a good time to look at greater connectivity with not just India for Lanka, but with South Asian neighbors, because as had been demonstrated, it was the neighbors that came to the rescue of Lanka, particularly India, in its time of crisis. There are also some general lessons that leaders and political parties and countries in this region can learn from the current turmoil in Sri Lanka. First among them is that a party with a brute majority can lose it very quickly, as we saw in Sri Lanka within 2 years. The SLPP had a landslide majority in parliament, and the president, Mr. Gotabaya, was elected also with a majority. Both of them have lost support. The second is corruption and inefficiency of governance, as well as on inflation and unemployment. People's tolerance levels are limited. If it crosses a certain point, they will take to the streets, as we saw in Sri Lanka, as we saw in Pakistan, and remove the ruling dispensation. The third point that is very important is that what I had mentioned earlier, connectivity between these countries. The greater the connectivity, the greater the relationship between the two countries, in a time of crisis as what had happened, we can come to the neighbor's rescue. And that's a very, very important lesson. Finally, we hope that the situation in Sri Lanka improves and its political formations remain stable and it regains its economic prosperity. India wants Sri Lanka to have a speedy recovery, and it should try to do as much as possible to ensure that happens. Thank you for listening to Nothing But the Truth. Look forward to you listening to me next week.